Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Every man has greatness lying dormant within him. Bryan and I are here to help you wake that up. You see, each man has two lives. The first life is the good enough life, the guy who shrinks back from his edge in the name of preserving comfort and safety. And the second life, the one that we aspire to living, is tapping that great man within us. He who plays life at his edge and lives his fullest potential. He who discovers and lives the great man within him lives a life of purpose and passion, a life to be inspired by and proud of. So today, Bryan and I explore four powerful masculine archetypes: the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. These archetypes are essential contributors to discovering and living your great man more often. For example, the man who knows how and when to tap his king archetype leads businesses to extraordinary results without sacrificing his family or his health. He creates environments where he and everyone he cares about can thrive. He leaves the world a better place than how he found it. The man who knows how to tap his warrior knows what he stands for and is willing to fight for it. He walks through life always alive, alert, and fully in his power. He has an undying loyalty to something bigger than himself. Bryan and I unpack each of the archetypes in this way and make it really practical for you in your everyday living so that you can discover and live the great man within you. All right, buddy, I thought we'd kick off this week's episode with a reflection from one of our listeners, Mark Miller, who is a man that I met at a keynote speech that I gave a few years ago. We've stayed in touch. He's followed our work. And he wrote a post on LinkedIn pointing to one of the episodes that he found most impactful. And I wanted to read it so you could hear it, Bri. And I also wanted our audience to hear it as well. So he said, "Here's the best thing that I have listened to, read, watched, or heard this week. It was the Great Man Within podcast episode, How White Men Can Have Better Conversations About Race with B. Arthur. B. Arthur is a Black woman and founder CEO of The Difference, which provides on-demand therapy and discusses how white men can become more educated about race and help extinguish racism from our society. B discusses how white men should acknowledge that racism exists, help fight it by overcorrecting, be brave by becoming friends with more Black people, and attending diversity events. She says, you can't change the world if you don't know the world." Also mentioned was the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which discusses why it's so hard for white men to talk about race. Racism is not solely done by white men wearing white robes. Racism is much more often found in microaggressions or microassumptions that white men make about people of color. We must actively combat racism by accepting that these things exist and learn about the experiences of people of color. Mark, wanted to say thank you for that, my friend. And Bryan, what's coming up for you, man, as I read that?
Well, first of all, Mark Miller, MVP of reviews. Dominic, you so nicely ask our listeners to provide a review on whatever platform you're listening to the podcast on. And he went above and beyond. He said, I'll do that. Plus LinkedIn, boom. So thank you, Mark. I remember having so much nervous energy going into that conversation with B. Arthur. I remember having conversations with some of my white friends about doing the podcast, and they were nervous for me. Like, oh my God, Bryan, don't say something wrong. You're going to get, you're going to get yourself into trouble. I remember feeling, even in that, if you remember that podcast, you and I were both stumbling over our words sometimes because we were really trying to figure it out. And that was before George Floyd, before what we're currently living in. I am so thankful that we had that conversation then, and we at least got a piece of how to start having these conversations before this happened. I'm looking forward to having B. Arthur back on for sure and continuing these conversations around race and opening our perspectives and learning. He mentioned white fragility. And even after that, I hadn't read White Fragility. I have about an hour left on my audiobook. still a very, very relevant topic.
Yeah, I mean, White Fragility is a book that I've referenced a number of times in some of the anti-racism episodes that we've done. But for anyone that this calls to, you can go back to the episode with B. Arthur called How White Men Can Have Better Conversations About Race. And one of the exciting updates that is going to be coming in the next few weeks, and maybe even by the time that this releases, it'll be in play, is we're going to go and number all of our episodes. And this came as a suggestion from Michael Young, who's one of the anchors of the Great Man Mastermind. So we can have a quick reference and I'll be able to point you to, hey, it's episode number, 112 versus you having to go scroll through and find all of that. So that will make it a much easier user experience for you. All right. So the conversation today is helping you to further refine who your great man is, right? Like defining what it means to be a man on your own terms. And, one of the episodes that we've done that I think it's one of our top 15 most downloaded, Bryan, of like our 120 or something episodes.
Yeah, I really wish I had a number so we could point our listeners to it.
I know. It's an episode called like Break These BS Rules of Being a Man. And these BS rules are predicated on this concept of a man box, right? Like we are socialized into this man box from a very early age. The man box has like these walls, these invisible walls that tell you like whether or not you're a man. And some of those are, if you are a dominant guy, if you are strong, if you are heterosexual, if you are prolific in bed with women, like these are things that are defined as you being in the box of manhood, which basically means you get to keep your man card. But if you fall outside of that, then you lose your masculinity. And so most men unconsciously fight for staying in the box because it allows them to keep their man card. And over the course of our lives, we end up unhappy, we end up distant, we end up, some cases, misogynistic, or at least having blind spots. And a big part of the work that we do here on the show is helping you to discover and live the great man within you. And so today is going to be a deeper conversation around one of my favorite books, one I know a book that you've read as well, I've gotten a lot of value out of, which is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette.
When I first read this book, I often highlight when I read. And I was looking back as we're preparing for this episode, I was looking back and I saw pen. I saw two different colors of pen. I saw two different colors of highlighting. I saw illustrations and I saw circles and I saw everything. Because I remember as I went through this, it felt like a mind expanded. Like, yes, like, oh, that's the thing that I've always felt, but never could really name. And when he talks about these archetypes that we'll go through here in a moment, I could identify places in my life where I felt like the tyrant versus the king, or I felt like, and I showed up as this boyish type energy.
Hell yeah. And in a minute, I know you're going to read what the boy psychology is. And we're going to delineate what it means to be a boy and what boy psychology is from man psychology and what that means. But I think what's helpful as starting place is, for those of you who maybe haven't listened to a lot of our recent episodes where we talk more deeply about what it means to be a great man, we have this belief that inside of us, inside of every man, there is a great man, right? This is the guy that lives his fullest potential. This is the guy that if you can tap into him, he's the one who has courage in the scariest of situations. He's the one who has vision when there's a lack of clarity. We have the definition of hell that we've talked about on the show a number of times. The definition of hell being at the end of your life, the man that you became meets the man you could have become. Right? Like you left chips on the table, like you didn't fulfill your potential. It's because most men never tap into the great man, right? Most men just settle for a life of safety, predictability, control, and settle for good enough. But if we tap into that great man within us, that's where we live a life of passion. That's where we regularly hit optimal performance. That's where we fulfill our potential. And when I have started to define and build a better relationship with who my own great man is, I know that these 4 archetypes of king, warrior, magician, and lover have really helped me to refine and delineate who that great version of myself is.
Yeah, I know we did in the mastermind, Dominic, we did a meditation or visualization where we got to meet our great man and we could visualize what that guy looked like, his demeanor, his energy. And when I look back at some of these archetypes, I'm like, oh, that's where that was. That was the great man. Yeah. And so I'm liking this because what we have is this defined man box that you discussed. And I forget which book it was, but it was created by a men's group, I think in the 80s out of Oakland.
Yep.
And you named some of the things that belong in that man box. But what we didn't have in that episode was, well, what does the great man within box contain? What are the possible tools that we can look and ping off of? So that's why I'm excited about today's conversation, because we can start to look at those.
Yeah. I mean, instead of someone handing you a box, society handing you a box and saying, this is what manhood means, you get to define your own box, right? And that's the most empowering part. And the book that it was in was Cleo Stiller's Modern Manhood,
Yes.
where both you and I were referenced. That's where we learned about that. All right, let me give you a quick overview of these 4 archetypes. And then I think what I'd love for you, Bryan, to do is just read that passage of the difference between like being a boy versus being a man. We're going to go into each one of these archetypes much more deeply. An archetype in its very nature is basically a set of attributes, right? Like key characteristics of a particular way of being. So a king is the archetype of, examples of that throughout history are, kings in Roman times. You think about CEOs in today's modern businesses. You think about presidents of countries and monarchs and prime ministers. These are different versions of what a king could look like. There are benevolent kings. There are tyrant kings. There are dictators. There are many different forms of kings that show up in everyday life. The warrior is the archetype of, this is the man who will fight for anything that subscribes to a cause bigger than himself. In many cases, sacrificing his own ego, sacrificing his own fame for something that he believes in. The magician has transformative powers, right? The magician is someone who can see deep eternal truths beyond just the reality of the moment and have a vision, see how the interconnectedness of things and create movements and create magic in moments where everyone else just sees mundane. And then the lover is the part of the man that sees vibrancy, sees beauty in everything, whether it's in a romantic connection or just being able to walk down Fifth Avenue and marvel at the buildings and the architecture, marvel at the diversity of the people, or be able to walk into, do a hike in the woods in the Rocky Mountains and take in all of nature and actually feel it at the core. That's the archetype of lover. And what Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette posit, these are the authors of the book, is that a man, a fully integrated man, embodies all 4 of these archetypes. And when we don't, we often end up as boys, right? Boys running around in men's bodies. So why don't you read the passage from King, Warrior, Magician, Lover that I know I read in one of the previous episodes, but it's been a while, so I think it's a good refresher for what examples of boy psychology is.
The drug dealer, the ducking and diving political leader, the wife beater, the chronically crabby boss, the hot shot junior executive, the unfaithful husband, the company yes man, the indifferent graduate school advisor, the holier than thou minister, the gang member, the father who can never find time to attend his daughter's programs, the coach who ridicules his stars, the therapist who unconsciously attacks his clients, and the yuppie. All these men have something in common. They are boys pretending to be men.
Boys pretending to be men. In our society today, we don't have these rituals or rites of passage that clearly delineate we're leaving boyhood behind. We're stepping into manhood. I remember, I think I gave this example a few weeks ago too. When I went to the University of Richmond, I encountered really one of the few wise elder male mentors in my life, Dean Mateer, right? And he was the dean of men, the College of Men. It was an integrated school. We had both women and men in the school, but we did a lot of things with just men only. And I was an 18-year-old boy. But when we got together in student government meetings and we referred to each other as boys, he interrupted us. And he was like, no, you are men now. It's time to leave your boyish ways behind. And there was some conversation around what it meant to be a boy versus being a man. But in our modern society, not a lot of that happens. Like at the same time, Bryan, that was happening, I was also pledging fraternity where, I was being hazed, which is the immature version of an initiation that we see in, a lot of modern society. But most men don't even have the benefit that I had of having a wise elder point out, no, you're no longer a boy. You're a man now.
The next sentence, the part that I didn't go to quite yet, is they got that way because nobody showed them what a mature man is like. And that's what you're describing.
Right.
And we have lost over time these rituals. Now we have like fake rituals. We have birthdays, we have bar mitzvahs, we have other graduations. but there's not really a lesson. There's not really a teaching. It's certainly a celebration, which is great, but there's no real teaching. So I'm curious, in that moment, when you guys discussed boy versus man, obviously you remember it. Is that something you took in at the time? Is that something that you put into practice?
I took it in. I don't think there was enough support or exercise or ritual to like actually fully drop me into the understanding of what it meant to transition from boyhood to manhood. I did definitely notice that there was a new standard that was set for me. Do you know what I mean? Like when he sat in the room of the 25 of us student governors who had been elected by our peers to be on the Student Government Association, that we were no longer like some of our immature joking, showing up late, being dismissive of others. Like he wouldn't tolerate that stuff because that was boyish behavior. So there was definitely a standard that was set, but there was certainly a hell of a lot more that we could have done to understand the difference between, what it means to be a boy and then a healthy man. And that's why these archetypes of king, warrior, magician, lover help us to define and delineate these parts of us that are either mature because we've worked on them or parts of us that are immature. Let me give you an example about the lover archetype. In the lover archetype, in every one of these archetypes, they talk about like the mature and healthy masculine, but they also talk about the immature, unhealthy masculine. Many of you listeners know that a part of my history is I've spent 4 years in Sex Addicts Anonymous. Sex addiction was something, compulsive sexual behavior ran my life for a period of a couple decades until I went and got help back in 2013. And I want to pull out some quotes here from the shadow side of the lover archetype. Actually, first, let's talk about the lover in his fullness. So the lover is of healthy embodiment, of being in the world of sensuous pleasure and in one's own body without shame. The lover is deeply sensual, sensitive to the physical world and all its splendor. All things are bound to each other in mysterious ways for the lover. Right? That's a powerful way of defining it. Now, the shadow lover, there's two sides to the shadow lover. There's the addicted lover and then the impotent. The addicted lover has an energy to it. The impotent is more passive. So how does the addict possess a man? The primary and most deeply disturbing characteristic of the shadow lover as addict is his lostness. I can really relate to this. Pulled first one way and then another, he is not the master of his own fate. He becomes the victim of his own sensitivity. This lostness, too, shows up in the way the addict lives for the pleasure of the moment only and locks us into a web of immobility from which we cannot escape.
That sounds needy, too. I know Mark Manson talks about this a lot. It's a very needy inability to feel fulfilled.
Of course. And we talk about this only looking for the pleasure of the moment, right? And when we did that interview with Crystal around the intro to Tantra, she talked about how porn really just kind of satisfies this carnal desire, like this need of the moment, this hunger for the moment, but it does not satisfy our emotional bodies or our spiritual bodies. I was constantly going from one impulse to another, right? In this moment, I felt alone. I felt overwhelmed. I felt stressed out. And I just needed some hit to get me past, whether it was sexting women, whether it was starting a new conquest, constantly being excited by the new lover, porn. And I was lost. Like that lostness really hits home. And so I spent years, decades of my life just bouncing from one thing to the next, one titillating excitement to the next, and then feeling empty and shameful in the process.
Yeah, I think, Dominic, just to clarify, what you're saying is that porn by itself, sexting by itself, these are not necessarily bad things.
Right.
But if they're done unconsciously and there's that addicted pull to it, and it's like you need that constant hit to keep going, boom, like it's very clear in the shadow side of this. Whereas the lover can do these things, but feels fulfillment in them. They feel connection in them, and it's just unconsciously.
Yeah, I think the distinction between the two is one is lost, unconscious, and the other one is intentional, right? I mean, like you and I both watch porn now, but we are much more intentional. There's not a lostness experience to it. It's like, if I'm going to go and watch porn, I know the kind of porn that's going to make me feel good. I know why I'm watching it. I know how it's going to satisfy my needs. And you and I have both found that in our lives, when it comes to romantic relationships, we want something that goes deeper. There was a part of both of our past where we went for breadth. We wanted, variety of women, having a stable or having multiple women that we could access at any point in time. was something that we prioritized, but that was indicative of our lostness. And now once we've replaced that with depth, and instead of needing to have, sex with 1,000 different women, you can have sex with one woman 1,000 different ways by going deep with her.
Yeah, which by the way is like to continue that path, Dominic, it's exhausting. It's not possible. It doesn't even leave room for other parts of life if that breadth is what we're constantly after and in need of. When I started this work, I started to look at a lot of my patterns. And one of the patterns that I looked at in my life, which was very much in this addicted lover shadow side, was I'm like, I can't continue to, quote, perform in a sexual way with one woman. So like, what do I do? And then sex would get boring, and then that would destroy the relationship and it would move forward. And I said, this is just unsustainable. And so I tell that story only because we can talk about them as archetypes right now and then know and then move forward faster. Otherwise, we can be stuck in a cycle for years and years and years and never really get out. And that's something they talk about in this book, where most of us stay stagnant in this boyish mentality, in this boyish psychology.
I love that, man. Exactly right. That's why we're talking about these archetypes, is to bring awareness to this moment so you don't get stuck in one of the boy ways of behaving for years or decades. Like I got stuck in the shadow addicted lover for so many years. And what it says here is that what the addict is seeking, even though he doesn't know it, the addict is seeking the ultimate and continuous orgasm, right? The ultimate and continuous high. This is why he rides from village to village, from adventure to adventure. This is why he goes from one woman to another. Each time a woman confronts him with her mortality, meaning like her imperfections, her weaknesses, her limitations, it shatters his dream of perfection. And the illusion of perfect union with her and God or the world is tarnished. He then saddles back up again and rides out looking for renewal of ecstasy. It's
so good, man. After about 25 ex-girlfriends, I finally said, maybe it's me. Like I'm the consistent thing in all of this.
You're a slow learner, huh?
But that took 35 like me, years. Man. You know what I'm saying? Like, so yeah. And the dangerous part is that we don't know we're stuck. We just start to believe that this is the only way, and maybe happiness in relationship and in sex isn't even possible. And so what these archetypes tell us is like, no, actually, that's a false belief. That's actually not the only way that this goes. And so whether it's the lover, the magician, the king, the warrior, these are new ways, new mental models that we can look at and work from.
Totally. And what I just described to you is not just particular to the romantic context. You can look at the same thing in how people jump from business to business or job to job or move from city to city, because there's always this like, oh, well, that place is going to be better. On New York, it's hard to date in, or New York, it's where the rat race is. You move to Denver, and then Denver's fun for a period of time. And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, but Denver's too crunchy or crusty. And then I'm going to go to, like San Diego, like from one place to the next because there is no center. Now, the other side, the passive pole of the lover, is the impotent lover. And I think it's really important to bring this one up too. The impotent lover experiences life in an unfeeling way. He feels sterility and flatness. There's a lack of enthusiasm, vividness, or aliveness. He's bored and listless. He has a monotone voice. Now, I think about one of my favorite shows, Breaking Bad, Walter White's character at the very beginning of season 1, episode 1. He is the embodiment of the impotent lover. He's one of the most talented, smartest, heavily decorated chemists in the world, except he's teaching high school chemistry to kids who have no concern and no care for whatever it is he's teaching. They're not paying attention to him. He is bored. He is lifeless. He gets pushed around by other people. He's impotent in bed. And then within that first episode, when he finds that he has this like passion for cooking meth, that it suddenly sparks this new sense of aliveness in him. And the very last scene of the first episode is like, he basically bends his wife over and just like ravages her in bed. And she has no idea who he is because she hasn't seen that inside of him in such a long period of time. I know what it's like to bounce back and forth between addicted lover to impotent lover, because after I'd numbed myself out from my conquests of women or porn, I had nothing left in my tank. And the rest of life, like I could walk down a bustling New York City and not have any appreciation for the diversity or the architecture in the city or the majestic way that all of these complex components come together, I missed all of that because I was impotent in my energetic sense of being.
Yeah, there's a numbness to it. And when we talk about the spice of life and what keeps things alive, you mentioned this in the very beginning of this podcast, but being able to go to Colorado and look at the beauty of the mountains and like take it all in, that seems like in my past, I'm like, you're crazy, man. Like, it's just a tree. Like, relax.
Yeah, right.
But the lover part can really, really see the beauty. And it's not just in other things, but it's in other people. And I know there was a huge shift in me, especially with my relationship and with guys. Like, my only relationship with guys before was in the immature, either king or warrior energy. And there was no lover, which sounds weird, but it allowed me to see guys that I didn't even know with a level of compassion and a level of like, oh, isn't this a beautiful human? And that allowed me to connect with other guys in way, way different, deeper ways.
Yes. Like what you're talking about is now being able to see nuance, like to be able to go beyond the surface and recognize and appreciate all of the little micro things that make up a human being or just make up your environment. Like one of the things in the book that Moore and Gillette talk about is anybody who's an aficionado of anything has already tapped into the lover archetype, right? You could be a cigar aficionado. You could be an aficionado of boats. You could love food, right? And understand what it's like to go to a farmer's market and pick out the perfect herbs for your omelet on Saturday morning. Like if you have that deep level of depth and love, then you've already connected to that archetype of lover.
Which, by the way, and as a byproduct of that, you become really interesting because your interest, your desire to go deeper in these different areas of life make you more interesting, which makes you more attractive, and it's a great upward cycle.
No doubt. I mean, we are fascinated by people who are fascinated by their own lives. You know, like we love people who are masters at their crafts, the musicians, the athletes, and these are the ones who have love for whatever it is they're doing. And you become magnetic, right? Like you're a magnet for others. You become more interesting.
I remember I was talking to a guy a couple of years ago, and he lived in the city, but he had a pepper farm. I don't know if it was on his rooftop or on his balcony, but dude, this guy could talk about every different type of pepper that you can possibly grow in any kind of environment and what to cook with it. And he was in love with peppers. I still remember that conversation. This guy was so into it. And you don't get there with just living the numb version of life.
Totally, man. So yeah, so we're looking at these archetypes. You know, one of the things that we were having fun with before we hit record was looking at our favorite TV shows, movies, and looking at some of these archetypes and how they're embodied. Now, one of my favorite shows of all time is the show 24, right? With Kiefer Sutherland, Jack Bauer. And if you look at King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, if you've watched the show, President Palmer is the ultimate king. Jack Bauer is the ultimate warrior, right? He's this reluctant, he doesn't love what he has to do. He hates killing people, but he does it for love of country. He doesn't do it for ego. He's like the ultimate warrior. The magician, if you look at seasons, 1, 2, and 3, Nina, like the manipulative, she's, basically the mole, the spy, even though she looks like she's the one that's on Jack Bauer's team. And then Tony Almeida is the requisite lover. Like he's the prototypical lover. He's the one that puts his love for the individual in front of him before his love for country. And you see him grapple with that throughout most of the seasons of the show. And the reason why we love shows like that is because they so deeply embody these archetypes that we are familiar with throughout the course of human history, throughout the course of storytelling, and also throughout the course of how we live our lives as well.
Whenever you say 24, all I can think about is Jack Bauer saying, "Where's the bomb?" That's all I can think about. Okay, so we also talked about Game of Thrones. Do Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Game of Thrones. So if we want to talk about immature boy king, so in each of the archetypes, there's the mature masculine. So let's talk about king as the mature masculine. The immature masculine, which would be the boy, is the divine child. Okay. Now, the shadow side of immature divine child is the high chair tyrant. That is King Joffrey. Right? The high chair tyrant is King Joffrey, right? Like that kid believes the world exists to serve his needs He doesn't listen to anybody else. It's all about him, and he is the epitome of a tyrant.
Yeah, and who liked that guy?
No one liked that guy. He was one of the scariest of all time. Okay, warrior archetype, Jon Snow. Jon Snow is the perfect warrior archetype. So for most of the show, he ascends to kingship. Like he's the reluctant king. People see him as a king. He stands for a code, right? He protects the people in his kingdom. He will go to the wall, which is where just a bunch of kind of rejects have been sent to protect in the worst of conditions with no access to pretty much any women or have a future of a family. Like you are there to protect the kingdom, the honor of the kingdom. And you're not famous. You're not rewarded for it handsomely. Like you are doing it. You're actually putting yourself behind to protect something bigger than yourself. And he was the epitome of that.
Yeah, he's the man psychology of the warrior. And there's so many other characters because the show is so violent that exhibit the traits of the shadow warrior, right? The sadist, the masochist. God. Like I think of what was the dog? Was that the name of the character? The big guy. He had his brother was the mountain.
Yeah. That's right. The dog. Yeah, what's a sadist? Sadist, someone who likes pain inflicted on them. The masochist. I can't remember. I always forget those two.
He had a little bit of both in him.
Yeah. Yep. And like, that's why the show is so great is because it draws upon these archetypes. Tywin Lannister, Peter Dinklage. I used to see him like walking out of the Equinox in the West Village. Peter Dinklage, magician, right? Like he's a magic maker. Through his words, he can weave tales. People looked at him as like just this cancer, as like a human, like they dismissed him, but he was able through his language to create vision, to bring people together, unlikely unions together because of his magic of language. If you want to look at the shadow version of that is Littlefinger, the manipulator, right? Like the guy who works behind the scenes and manipulates.
And I love the specificity around this, the detached manipulator. Right. And here's another thing we haven't talked about, but all these archetypes, they work together and they can build on each other, whether we're in boy psychology or man psychology. And Littlefinger is such a great description of the detached manipulator and the addicted lover across the board.
That's right. That's actually great because he owned the brothel,
He owned
right?
the brothel and he always had the love for this woman, but couldn't really get it to connect.
Yeah. When you want to talk about detached manipulator, that's also Walter White from Breaking Bad. Like he is a majestic manipulator. He basically is the puppeteer of everybody in his life. So he's got that shadow magician. But the other thing is, like in our own existence and also in these characters, they're not just one archetype and one archetype only, right? There's multiple archetypes. And like we said before, a fully integrated man learns how to bring online king, warrior, magician, lover at different points. What Moore and Gillette say in the book is the king archetype tends to be the archetype that comes online last for most men because it requires almost the most amount of responsibility. One of the things that we talk about on the show is a great man creates environments where he and those he cares about can thrive. And we came up with that based on Moore and Gillette's definition of what it means to be a king, right? A king knows how to organize the assets of his kingdom. He knows how to do so in a way that allows for his kingdom to flourish and everything inside of it to flourish, right? The king provides blessings and acknowledgement to those who are in his kingdom. Think about a king who doesn't do this well, like a CEO who doesn't know any of his employees beyond his direct reports, right? Think of how many CEOs are like that. They know one layer down, maybe two layers down, but then the other, hundreds or thousands of people, they don't know or care to know anyone that's actually doing the work at the ground level. Those people feel ignored. There's resentment towards their king. And as we see tyrants in stories of like Game of Thrones or others, the common folk have no connection to their kings. They revolt against their kings as soon as they're given a chance to because they've not been seen by their king.
The focus is on either self, am I doing this just for myself? As opposed to, can I take those energies and spread them out across the kingdom or across the company, knowing full well that comes back full cycle, and what is good for everybody here will also eventually be good for the king, for me. And so when you say great men create environments for themselves and others to thrive, right, that's what we're talking about. Now, what that doesn't go to, and I hear this a lot in the corporate space, is at the individual level, something may not feel like the CEO is doing something king-like for that individual. because the king also knows when something needs to be cut off, when something isn't working because it's not good for the kingdom.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there are times where people in the kingdom will not like a decision or will be personally impacted by something, maybe because the decision the king has made affects them more individually than the rest of the group. But the king can see collectively what is the best need so they can flourish. Look, one of the greatest kings that I look to for leadership is Phil Jackson, right? The legendary coach of the Bulls and then the Lakers. One of the things that he says in his book, Sacred Hoops, is it became incumbent upon me, imperative upon me to make sure that all 12 men on the basketball team had an essential role. Most other coaches would just look at 7 or 8 guys on the team and say, I'm going to build a team with you 7 or 8. I'm going to rotate you guys in on the court. The other 3 or 4 guys are kind of afterthoughts. I don't care if you play or not. And then you build a team where 25% of the players feel irrelevant, right? And one of the things that Phil Jackson was able to do, of course, he had the greatest player of all time with Michael Jordan. They won 6 titles together. But you have to remember, Jordan didn't win any championships in the first 6 years of him playing until Phil Jackson came along and assembled a team around him, a culture around them, where every single guy on that team had an essential role. And if you watch The Last Dance, you will see that there were so many games that Michael Jordan had to dish the ball off to a Steve Kerr or to a John Paxson or to a Tony Kukoc who had to make the shot to win the game. It was not always Michael Jordan. And it was because Phil Jackson, the king, knew how to organize the assets of the kingdom to allow Jordan to be Magic and all the other 11 players on the team to have a vital role as well.
It's cool that you brought Phil Jackson up with the king archetype here, because I always thought about him as the magician, of being able to work behind the scenes. Yeah. But I like the description of knowing the role that every single person can play, because that's so relevant to teams of all kind.
One of the things about magician, as you brought this up with Phil Jackson, is being able to see deeper truth and connect dots where others cannot. He was the first person to bring spirituality into basketball. I mean, he was the guy who, you're talking about in the 1980s and 1990s. Like, this was 3 decades ago. Like, he was a pioneer. He brought in meditation. He brought in visualization. He brought in teachings from the Lakota tribe, the indigenous population here with our Native Americans, and connected the dots to basketball. He talks about implementing the triangle offense, which is basically Buddhism, or I think it was a Tao, one of those in practice, like on the basketball court. So that is magic in its very essence.
So Donna, we've talked a lot about the lover. We just went through the king. We've had a pretty good deep dive on magician. I want to hear some of your takes on the warrior, because I think this is one of the areas in my life that I've struggled with, of knowing when to step in. Like, what is the man psychology behind warrior versus what I think I used to do was live in the boy area of warrior.
Yeah, the boy area of warrior is the hero, right? So the immature version of warrior is the hero and the mature version is the warrior. And we've talked about this concept a couple of times on other episodes, but a great example of hero energy is Tom Cruise he's Maverick in Top Gun, right? He's the hero. He subscribes only to himself. He's freewheeling. He doesn't care about his impact on others. And then he goes and gets his boy Goose killed because of his antics, right? Hero is huge in the American society. Like, we love heroes. A lot of our stories are about heroes who go and conquer for themselves, not necessarily looking at the impact that has on others. The warrior subscribes to something bigger than himself. So let's read a bit of the warrior energy. And this is where I think a lot of men could do some deeper work. Like, what do you stand for? And warrior energy is coming online quite a bit now as we're talking about recovering from a pandemic and a racial revolution. There are lots of people who are now emerging as warriors to fight for a cause that is bigger than themselves. All right. As Morin and Gillette say, this is the age in the West of the, quote, soft masculine. Like all repressed archetypes, the warrior goes underground only to eventually resurface in the form of emotional and physical violence. Most of us have been taught that, like, the warrior is maybe not welcome, but it's based on our lack of understanding of what warrior energy really is. Healthy warrior energy is a vital ingredient in our world building and plays an important role in extending the benefits of the highest human virtues and cultural achievements to all of humanity. A warrior in his fullness. Aggressiveness is a stance toward life that rouses, energizes, and motivates. It pushes us to take the offensive and to move out of a defensive or holding position about life's tasks and problems. The samurai advice was always to leap into battle with the full potential of chi, or vital energy, at your disposal. So it's the warrior who's saying, yes, I'm ready to take battle. Yes, I'm willing to go after something that I believe in, but something that's bigger than me as well. I'm not going to stand here in a defensive posture. I've talked about the differentiation between life-preserving energy and life-giving energy. The warrior is about life-giving energy. Someone who's life-preserving is just trying to protect what he has, not necessarily looking to grow. What's coming up for you as you're hearing this stuff?
I'm looking at the boy psychology of the warrior, which is called the hero. And the two shadow sides of that, one is called the grandstander bully, and the other side is the coward.
Yep.
And similar to you, Dominic, when you discussed this in the lover, the addicted lover versus the impotent lover, I think this is the area for me in my life where I did a lot of grandstand bullying and then a lot of cowarding. I really struggled with, like, where's my power at? Because I feel really powerful when I'm grandstanding, but then that's gotten me into a lot of trouble. So like, then I'll shrink and I'll be shorter and I won't stand up for those things that I believe in.
Or you won't play the game. Like, you won't go after what you really want in life, right? Like whether it was starting a business or going after the woman that you want, right? Like those are cowardly, not stepping into the arena postures.
Right. And the part that you read about it will stay underground until it explodes, right? That was the trajectory that I've been on for a long part of my life. And so what I'm hearing here is, if you know what you stand for, you know what those virtues are, those values are, then fighting for that and being ready to fight for that, right? That is the man psychology of the warrior. And I always thought that, like, wait a second, pacifist. So therefore warrior is bad. But that also felt really weak. And so coming to the conclusion of, yes, being a warrior for something bigger than just me feels really powerful and a good place to be.
And this is where, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships where men and women are together, women are scared of the unhinged, right? The shadow warrior. They're scared of the guy that is not in touch with this part of his archetype, that goes underground only to explode. They're scared of that guy. And then the lessons that a lot of us have learned from that erroneously is that, like, we shouldn't feel connected to that energy at all. Women want our warrior energy, but that is refined energy. That is like, you will stand up for her. You will fight for your life. You will fight for your family. You will fight for her life. You will protect. You will go out and grow. You will stand up for what you believe in. She wants that. That's where the fuck is, right? I mean, that's where the sex is. And the warrior is always alert. He is always awake. He is never sleeping through life. A warrior knows what he wants and how to get it. That's what Moore and Gillette have to say. And there's so many guys who don't know what they want, who don't know what they stand for, who are asleep until something comes along and wakes them up, and either they retreat into cowardice or they'll explode, which isn't sexy, which isn't intentional, which isn't conscious.
One of the words that's coming to me now as you're describing these things is this idea of patriarchy.
Oh, yeah.
And how the patriarchy really can be described by some of those boyish psychology, that sort of psychology, that sort of mentality, and how women and guys have attributed all masculine to this idea of patriarchy. And it's like, I know you feel this way, Dominic, I feel this way, that yes, we are men, but feel as though that we dislike the patriarchy because the patriarchy is this boy psychology bullshit.
That's right.
That's the true destroyers of the world, not the true mature masculine.
Right. The patriarchy has been no good for both men and women. Patriarchy is what creates the man box. The patriarchy is the expression of the immature masculine, right? It is the expression of boy psychology, stunted masculine, fixated at immature levels. Patriarchy is based on fear, the boy's fear of women, but also fear of men. Right? Like, think about how you and I were raised. We were raised to fear other men, like always competing with other guys, figuring out who was the alpha dog, the guy who was the threat to us. That's what patriarchy is in its fullest expression. And what we're talking about here is, especially inside of the warrior archetype, the warrior has a loyalty to something, right? A loyalty to something, a cause, a god, a people, a task, a nation that is larger than ourselves. It's not based on fear. It's based on love. That's one of the most important things to understand about warrior energy is it's based on love of something bigger than self. If you want to look at a woman who embodies warrior energy, Homeland, Claire Danes' character, her warrior, her love for country supersedes anything. That's why she goes and does all the crazy things where she gets shunned from society. But for her, she loves nothing more, and she's the ultimate warrior for her nation. And there's a consciousness, there's a choice to that, right? And most guys, I don't think, have made that choice.
Yeah. All right. So we've got the king, warrior, magician, lover. We've gone through some of the definitions of this and some of even the characters, be it fictional or real life, that embody this stuff. Now what? How do we start to bring this into our lives?
Yeah, I think one way of doing that, and I'll put a wrap on warrior energy because I think that seeing the shadow side of that will directly answer your question. I know that this for my lived experience. Compulsive personalities are workaholics, constantly with their noses to the grindstone, right? This is kind of warrior in its shadow energy. And this is what Moore and Gillette have to say about it. We have a tremendous capacity to endure pain. We often manage to get an enormous amount of work done. But what is driving my engine is deep anxiety, right? This is a part of the unconscious shadow warrior. So compulsive personalities can become workaholics, constantly with their noses to the grindstone, tremendous capacity to endure pain, to get things done. But what is really driving engines is deep anxiety. This is where we have panic attacks, right? This is where we achieve like crazy and never feel satisfied. We never even can feel the contentment. We can never fully let in the magnificence of our accomplishments. We can never really enjoy it. So when you say, how do we bring this into our lives? I think like one question I would love to ask our listeners right now is, are you driven by that compulsive thing to get things done, to achieve achievement addiction, but never really allowing in the feeling that comes along with it? That would be shadow warrior and disconnected from lover.
I think last night we had one of our mastermind meetups, and one of the guys said, we were talking about the feeling of overwhelm. And one of the guys said, overwhelm for me is when I felt really good about booking 10 hours of meetings back to back to back to back because I could take it and I could do it. And I was proud of that. And then a panic attack happened, or then something else happened. I started to feel overwhelmed. That's the immature warrior. That I can do this, I can sustain it, I can stay in it, nose to the grindstone, but the payoff's not there.
That's right. Right on. And that definition of like, look at that 10 hours of scheduling I'm going to schedule 10 consecutive hours and get so much done. Why would you do something like that? It's kind of like to prove to other people that you're a badass. Because like chances are you're not getting a lot of satisfaction. You're probably not feeling great if you're just tethered to your work for 10 consecutive hours, unless you know exactly what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think many of us base our definitions of success or what's badass on other people. What other people would see is, oh man, you work really hard. Oh man, you're the first one in, last one out. And then you get a source of pride of being that guy.
Yeah, it's like a badge. It's the busy badge. It's the badge of honor. It's like, I'm important because I'm busy. I'm doing this constantly. Like,
right.
Yeah.
I think a good question, Bryan, to ask yourself from like, where do we go here? I would actually kind of rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 of how connected you feel to each of these archetypes. Think about this, for example, the king archetype on a scale of 1 to 10, king in his fullness is a one who has total command over his kingdom. He can organize his assets of his kingdom, meaning like financial resources, meaning the people in his life, his business, his social life, his friendship. Can he organize it in a way where everything flourishes? Can he organize it in a way where everyone feels seen and not ignored? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself as a king right now? Next thing would be a warrior. Like, do you know what you stand for? Do you know what that thing is that's bigger than you? For me, I'm fighting for 10 million men to get on this path of doing inner work over the next 10 years. That's my mission that's bigger than me. And am I fighting for it? What would I rate myself on a scale of 1 to 10 in that space? The magician. Like my ability to find the magic in life, to see deeper truths, to connect the disconnected, to paint visions of a bigger future. Scale of 1 to 10, how connected do I feel to that archetype? And then the lover, which we spoke about at length in the beginning of the episode, the lover in his fullness can feel the vibrancy of life. He can appreciate the nuance. He can go deep, and he is an aficionado of the things in his life that he loves to spend time on. He feels a vibrancy, a potency, a vitality in his life, in everything he does. Scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself? Now, I would take a look at each of those numbers and then kind of take a look at which one do you feel most connected with and maybe double down there. Or you can look at the one that you feel the most disconnected from and say, okay, if I'm a 2 in king, what do I need to do to become a 5? And start to map out a plan there for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as you're asking those questions, Dominic, I'm just thinking about in my own life right now. And when you're thinking about like king, do I have mastery over everything in my life? And I immediately started to think through like, wait a second, what are the things that are actually important to me that really really move the needle on where I'm trying to be and how I feel like I have containment over those things. And then when it came to the warrior, like, what do I stand for? There's a lot of things I stand for. I give you a whole list of things I stand for, but like getting really clear on that. So I think like whether it's a 1 or a 10 or somewhere in between, for me, it started to make me think more critically about what are those things that matter most to me.
Right on. And I know that as you are building your, like this next version of your business to support testing and coronavirus and making sure that businesses are healthy as they're going back to work, I look at how can you call upon your king archetype? There's both king and warrior that are needed in that respect, right? Like a warrior is like you're standing for something that is going to help heal our nation, our economy, our workers, like fighting for that because it's going to get tough with regulations. It's going to get tough with competition. Are you willing to step into that warrior archetype that keeps you in the long haul? And then are you willing to step into your king archetype? Because as the leader of this business, you're going to have to organize employees, contractors, clients, you know what I mean? Freelancers, test subjects, all of these things where harmoniously they need to come together to create an experience that works.
Well, let's talk about that, the warrior, really quickly, because in my mind, what I've seen, whether it's been related to relationships and sex, or whether it's been related to being in environments in which I am not the majority, and that could be in largely female setting. It could be in a largely black setting, like B. Arthur was talking about, or even in work settings. What I've started to learn is that people do their best work, and that work could be work on the job. That could be relationships and sex. It could be connecting with others, but they do their best work when they feel safe.
Right.
And creating that level of safety is something I can fight for. That's something I believe in, is that everybody has the right to feel safe, and they do their best work when they do that. And so when I align to that, the warrior comes out at me. I can feel the chills right now. But if it's just talking about like, hey, just coronavirus testing, yeah, it's a really important part of it. But the bigger vision here, the thing I can stand up for and fight for, is this environment of feeling safe.
That's amazing, man. And if you keep that front and center with your work always, then whenever things get fuzzy, when a decision needs to be made and it's like, I don't know to choose A or to choose B, that becomes the decision maker. You put that on the table. Is this decision I'm about to make in honor and service of creating environments that are safe? Or does it detract from that, right? And like that helps you to make much more acutely defined decisions in the moment. Hey, if you've got an idea for an episode that you want Bryan and I to do a podcast on, or if you have a guest that you would want us to interview, let us know. Reach out through doinnerwork.com or email me directly at dominic@dominicq.com. Let us know what your idea is, who you want us to interview. Some of our best ideas have come from you. You've inspired some of our best episodes. So please let us know. And who knows, maybe you'll be seeing us do an episode on one of your ideas in the very near future.